Good day, everybody. Welcome once again to Wrestling with the Law. I'm Eric Anderson, your host. And I have to tell you, today is another one of those days that I'm beyond excited. There's the old saying that one who teaches is forever a student, and that is absolutely true. And this particular teacher is going to be learning a lot today because there's also another adage to remember, and that is that we look for the day when the teacher becomes the student and the student becomes the master. And you are about to see that today when we are going to meet Miss Flynn Coleman. Now, I had the joy, the absolute joy of teaching Flynn back when she was a ninth grade student back at the Brentwood School in Los Angeles. And since that time, let's go through, she has become a noted lawyer, an international human rights lawyer, foremost authority on it. She's a professor. She's currently a fellow over at Harvard University at the Kennedy School of Government. She has written a book, she's the author of The Human Algorithm. We're going to talk about that book, and don't let the science sound to it scare you off. She does some great storytelling in this book, and we're going to talk about that. She is also so interested in human economic empowerment and human rights. We're going to see if we get the chance to talk about her company's Molina. She's been a professor at the New School. She's been a founding scholar at NYU. I'm probably skipping 6 or 7 different other things she's done. I think the London School of Economics, as I recall. She's a graduate of Berkeley School of Law. I won't hold that against her. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great joy and pleasure that I get to introduce you to Miss Flynn Coleman. Professor Coleman, it is great to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm so honored and delighted to be here with you. Thank you for that very generous introduction.
Well, you've earned every single bit of it. Now, one of the things that we want to talk about as we get it, because I know this is going to be one of our shorter ones because you've got a lot that you have to run off to for. So I want to jump right into this. What is it that drew you to human rights law? Because I think it's fair to say, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it's fair to say that your background is it's a little privileged. So people will wonder sometimes, how do people who are privileged then discover that there's a problem in the world and by God, I want to find a way to fix it?
What an important question. And again, such a delight to sit down with you and to think about all the fond memories of being in your class and to be here. And to answer your question, I've always been interested in human rights and social justice. And when you say this word privilege, I think it's so incredibly important now more than ever that we think about these ideas. And the way I think about privilege is we have to spend it. And we have to amplify the voices of others. And we are here to serve and to care for each other and to build a brighter future for the generations that will be. Today is, of course, Congressman John Lewis's funeral, and his final essay that he wrote for the World came out. And, when he talks about good trouble and that it is our responsibility, every generation has a responsibility to be building justice and humanity and peace into the future that we ourselves might not see. And for me, that's at the core of every single thing that I do. And I believe we are here to kind of broaden that crucible of humanity, to be more radically inclusive, to be fighting for rights, to be fighting for justice, to be fighting for all of our humanity. And I think we're seeing now how very much on the line it is, of course, in this country, but around the world as well. And I had the great opportunity to spend a lot of my life living all around the world. And that's through volunteering and studying and working, but it started actually as a soccer player. And through that, I started playing soccer and living all around the world and having conversations with people from all walks of life is my great joy. And we learn so much when we tap into our empathy and our compassion. And I believe that we are here to build a more just and a more humane society. And that needs to be infused in everything that we do. And I also think that we need to do it knowing that we might not see the fruits of that labor, and that we are building something for our children's children's children. And we're here to learn to treat each other better. And from conversations I've had from people all around the world, being a war crimes genocide attorney, for example, doing international criminal justice work and human rights, I've seen the worst in humanity. I've seen the worst things that people do to each other, atrocity, crimes against humanity. But as a result of that, I've also seen the best, the courage, the resilience, the bravery. And every single day, I think about my friends around the world and people that have fought their entire lives for justice and for hope and for truth. And I believe it is our responsibility to pick up the mantle with whatever privileges, whatever we have in that moment, to do whatever we can with what we have in that moment.
Flynn, what was the first time when you, as let's say as an advocate, just getting into the human rights aspect, when you faced whether it's an atrocity or an event. I'm going to take these glasses off because I'm tired of the ring lights reflecting. You faced an atrocity that really made you start to think, okay, this is far away from anything I've been exposed to. I guess we could kind of call it your fish or cut bait moment, where you knew you could have walked away and gone back to the world you're in, or where you said, no, this is what I'm committed to being in.
There are so many touch points that I think about, and it's such a beautifully phrased question. One thing that always comes to mind is one of the first times that I was living abroad was when I moved to Italy to play soccer. And the family that I was living with, and it was in a very small town where everyone knew each other. And the family that I was living with, I became very close with. And they were people that faced a lot of discrimination in their lives because of who they were. And these people showed me the meaning of home, of family, of belonging, of how to treat other human beings, how to stand up for yourself, how to be a woman in a society that is constantly trying to bring you down. And I think about my friends a lot and what they faced. And for me, that was a touch point. I ended up studying human rights and international global justice issues through incredible teachers like yourself that taught me about history and how we face history and how we look at the patterns of the past to say never again, moving towards the future. And all of those touch points are always on the forefront of my mind when I think about what can we do today to bend things ever more slowly towards the light and towards justice. And it's the people I've met, the great honor I've had of being taught and mentored by people that are in this fight, and the people that I've seen that are heroes and doing extraordinary things wherever they have with that moment. And that really started with being exposed to different people from different places. And through sports, ironically, I learned a lot about that. And I learned about inequities and injustice. And again, no one of us can do everything, but we can all do something. And we can all join that chorus of people fighting for justice. And so it's really through people that I admire and I think about every day. And, this is for them. And we all need to we all also need to be amplifying the voices of others. Brian Stevenson, for example, who wrote Just Mercy and of course does incredible work, talks about those being most proximate to the problems and issues need to be central to the solutions. So it's all about listening and finding that compassion and empathy and moving those who've been marginalized toward the center, amplifying and empowering the voices of others. And that's also how we build a better future for all of us.
What made you think that law was going to be the best avenue for you to go down that road? Because I know, of course, now there's so many other things you're doing, but clearly law has been the point for you. It's where you started. It's where you've placed so much emphasis. What was it that made you think that was going to be the avenue for you first?
Yes, indeed. I have had for a long time a sense that I'd wanted to be a human rights lawyer and an advocate for justice and for humanity. And for me, laws are the contracts, the social contracts, the norms that bind us as a human society. And they're created by human beings to say, this is how we should treat each other. And of course, it's an evolving project. And laws are different depending on where you are in the world. And we're constantly learning from our failures of enforcement, even when laws are passed, even when we have, say, a beautiful document, legal document, we see how we fall short of enforcing it, or when rights have been rolled back for groups of people. And so for me, laws are the ways that we say, this is what binds us as a human society. And these are guidelines for how we treat each other. That being said, a lot of the most horrible things that people have ever done to each other were legal at the time. Incredibly important to remember that when we're thinking about possible edging into authoritarianism and fascism, and dehumanization can start under the guise of, well, it was legal at the time. And that's why studying history is so incredibly important, because laws are powerful mechanisms, but only when they're just and humane, and only when they're enforced, and only when they have communities in mind. So for me, it's this very powerful tool that we can use, but I also believe there are multiple different ways that we can use the law, and if necessary, sometimes to say, no, this is an unjust law and we need to change it. And I do think that the other reason the law has always been such a powerful mover is that We need to change norms and customs, but ultimately we do need to be changing policies and laws at every level so that people have the protections, those basic rights they deserve to be protected. I also believe the law needs to be something that more people understand, because I think it can also be wielded by people in positions of power where it's most traditionally been used and guarded. And so this idea of expanding that horizon of who gets access to legal services and to that understanding, not only of the law, but of having a voice in shaping it and making it better when it falls short.
Now, let's talk about, because there are a couple things there that really have gotten my interest, and I want to dig into a little bit more. One of them is when you're talking about being active in the law, I can already hear some people who listen and watch this podcast who are thinking, "Dag nabbit, that sounds like that wild communist liberalism to me." So how do you deal with when you're telling the story of trying to get people to think more about the human impact of the law and how it can be used as something to advance human rights? How do you tell the story to those who may seem more hesitant along the lines of, the law's worked perfectly fine for us so far, there's no reason for it to change it? How do you deal with that?
I think this is one of the questions of our times. We're certainly seeing this across the US and of course across the world, and being able to communicate and have conversations. I actually teach a class on how to have better conversations is incredibly important. And there's multiple facets within that question. I think one of them is the language we use to describe things. Very often someone will hear a loaded term and immediately be blocked from there. And the conversation can't go further because we're thinking about, well, they said something that really doesn't resonate. And I think deeply entrenched extremist partisanship is incredibly anathema to democracy, and it's dangerous. One of my great joys, as I mentioned, is to have conversations with people all around the world, and most specifically people who might be different than I am or have a different point of view. That's how we can learn and unlearn, because we all have biases and prejudices. We all have those based on our very, very ancient biology that trains us in a scarcity and a survival mindset. But we have the ability to move past that. And I do think this idea of civil discourse is an essential one of our times. And things like social media can really exacerbate and highlight extremist views to the detriment of more reflective, compassionate conversation. And I think that there's this idea of course, telling your story is so powerful, but also, as Chimamanda Adichie says, we need to make room for more than one story. There's also danger in having just a single story. So how are we finding ways to connect on truth and on things that we all believe in, while at the same time making room for diverse opinions? This is that experiment of democracy. And to those who might suggest that the law is perfect as it is, kind of what we're seeing with the global pandemic. The system isn't broken. It was actually only designed to benefit certain people. And when we look at our founding documents, for example, they were built by a very elitist, homogenous group of wealthy white male landowners.
Hold on, I just lost all the listeners in Alabama.
But again, I think that there's room to evolve and to think about things in new ways. And we can have these debates and conversations and say what has worked, what hasn't, and find a way to understand that we are all citizens and stewards of not just this one planet, but not just this one country, but also just this one planet, a fragile, dying planet that we all call home. And so I do think that, one of the things we start to see with the US is it's an enormous place. And so it's very easy for people to be siloed in their opinions, and social media also has an effect on that. And this is an ever evolving process. But if we start with the idea that we all have equal dignity and worth, then we can start to really, take some steps towards treating each other better. But I do think, thinking about history and the law, we need to take a look at understanding that, first of all, things that were set back in the day need evolving and need changing. And that also the things that are true today weren't necessarily true in the past. And I can think of myriad examples from science and technology to law. For example, now programming and computer science and the tech giants are very homogenous, especially in leadership in terms of who gets to be in charge. But the first programmers and the first coders were actually women, specifically Black women. And then they were pushed out when people said, "Oh, this isn't just a tedious secretarial job. There could be some clout in this.
There's some money in here."
Right? So the point is that history can teach us, and Hidden Figures, the book and the movie, did a beautiful job of showing us also that when we make more room in that crucible of humanity, we don't lose, we all gain. And I do think that fear has to do with it. And it's very in our nature to be afraid of the other. But I believe that otherism and exceptionalism is our most dangerous scourge. And we're seeing the tattered fabrics of society, and we need to find a way to come together.
Now, dealing with those truths sometimes can be exceedingly difficult. In fact, let me put the glass on, because I believe that there was somebody who wrote an article once regarding post-conflict justice. Do truth commissions work? And at the time, they were talking about the legacy of Argentina and Chile. Mm-hmm. Of course, the most famous truth commission is the one in South Africa. Mm-hmm. So here becomes my question. Do you think that one of the things that would be helpful is if countries or societies, including this one, had their own version of truth commissions? And the other question here is it even possible to be done in a place like the United States?
Now, that's a question. First of all, thank you for being one of the 3 people that at least read the title of my thesis. So I appreciate that. And yes, I've done a lot of work in international criminal justice, looking at the tribunal system, where I've also worked at the United Nations, the UN Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And I've also done a lot of work thinking about this idea of punitive justice and retribution and transitional or post-conflict justice, different ways that we come together. So as you said, Argentina and Chile have done truth commissions. I worked with one of the members in Chile when I was living there. And of course, South Africa has, as you said, the most famous example. And that's another example of a country with an incredibly beautiful modern constitution that, like many documents in enforcement and reality, fails to live up to some of those ideals and that experiment of moving ever closer to more justice. So truth commissions are incredibly powerful ideas because they're a way to say that justice just in a courtroom can be very elusive. And how can we find a way to find other ways that we can transition into a more peaceful, less horrifying future where voices are heard. And the reason truth commissions are so powerful is because they give voice to the voiceless, and they provide a record of atrocities and violations and abuse. And so oftentimes, and there's myriad examples around the world, for example, in Chile and Argentina, there was an era of disappearances where people were kidnapped. And the families wanted to understand what happened to their child so they could be buried properly and the family could move forward. But because of immunity clauses in certain deals like that, there were so many secrets that were kept. And I think the US is also very focused on punitive measures. Whereas if you look at some other systems around the world, for example, some trials in other countries are really more like fact-finding missions. And that's, of course, not what you see in the US, let alone what you see in the Hollywood movies about how justice happens. So in my opinion, we have work to do, much work to do in the US justice system, from mass incarceration to thinking about things about how we treat people. When you look at the Norwegian prison system, for example, you see huge differences. And so this idea of a truth commission is a way to say there are other ways. Transitional justice and restorative justice, while imperfect, like all systems, are a way to say, as Brian Stevenson would say, for example, no human being is the worst thing they've ever done. And that communities need to heal. My work in Rwanda, for example, showed me that after the genocide in 1994, families from the Tutsi and the Hutus had to come back and live next door to each other. So there needs to be a rebuilding beyond just a tribunal, for example, for an aging dictator, very, very far away from the healing that communities need to do. So in terms of a truth commission for the US, I love the idea. I proposed it for Myanmar, Burma many, many years ago. Almost 20 years ago. And I believe that these ways of bringing a record of who we are to the fore are not in and of themselves, they don't provide justice. But I do believe it's something that should be considered alongside things like reparations in this country.
See, now, when this gets to that storytelling aspect, because of course, I'm used to arguing and telling the story to a jury. And so, there are the elements. Have they established the elements? Have they not established the elements? Get a verdict. Everybody leaves. Nobody thinks again about what just happened, unless they're writing a book or something. Your form of storytelling is that you're dealing with a completely different kind of audience, with a completely different kind of objective. So it's funny because, as you know, with trials, often trials are won or lost not just about what's heard, but what you're able to keep out. And you're dealing in experiences in which your goal is to get everything out, or everything in, everything to be heard, everything to be considered. Because again, you're talking about that other aspect of lawyering that we don't deal with. You're talking about that restorative aspect of a community. So let's talk a little bit about, how do you gain the insight in each of those communities to know what aspects can you tell to make that proposal easier for them to swallow? And how do you deal with those people who are like, no, there's no way we're not going to tell you about everybody we killed. We're not doing that. Even if you give them immunity and they're like, I'm not doing that. How do you deal with that?
It's an important, really essential question. And I was thinking as you were speaking about the clerkships that I've done, one in the federal system and then one for the former Yugoslavia, and how, of course, in the advocacy system, the idea should be at least that we all have a right to competent counsel who is going to fight and advocate on our behalf. But of course, from the judge's perspective, that is actually looking at all different angles and trying to decide what to do with the outcome. And I do think what you're saying is incredibly important on multiple fronts, which is the idea of a trial or of connecting with the jury or working in the criminal justice system in a performative way. And that the reason for that is that human beings, in addition to being incredibly brilliant, are also very fallible, and our memories are malleable, and we connect with stories. Stories, as I say in the book, my book as well, are in our DNA. They're how we understand ourselves and others, which is why I am such a passionate, lifelong, voracious book lover, because stories are who we are. But the key is that we need to be reading diverse, inclusive stories from around the world. I mean, we have so much incredible wisdom at our fingertips when we're able to open a book, go to the library, go online now and read a book. We have stories from people near and far, and we can have conversations, not just with people that are still with us, but people long gone across time and space who are calling to us with these ideas. And human beings, our brains are not designed to take in, say, 1 million data points of 1 million people, which is of course true, that are dying from malnutrition, starvation, famine. These are things that are actually happening all over the world today. But the human brain doesn't take that in. That's faceless and nameless data points. The human brain takes in the story of one person who survived, one person who was able to communicate, which is why it's so incredibly important to not only tell stories, but to be really aware of why the human brain is so drawn to them. Of course, stories are also how we stay, abreast of what's happening in our communities. And back in the day, before social media or the internet, that was how we understood what was going on.
Yes.
And so another thing that comes to mind from your question is an idea Brene Brown talks about. So she says stories are just data with a soul. But the key other element is that she says, we all should be telling our story.
Wait, say that again, because I want people to really grasp what you just said.
That stories are data with a soul.
That's gorgeous.
Yeah, Brene Brown's quote. She has many gorgeous quotes, and that's one of them. But the key element that brings me to your question is she also talks about telling your story to those who've earned the right to hear it. Because there's telling stories, but as you said, there's always going to be an audience that isn't ready or willing or wanting to hear that. And that's why when we discussed earlier, this idea of language, it can block us. If we describe something, for example, as a riot or a mob, as opposed to a protest, or if we say the word left or right before we share our views, we've already entrenched people into their different camps. Now, there's an ancient biological reason for this, which is back in the day, we had to be able to immediately know if something coming at us in the night was safety or danger. So the human brain immediately categorizes and makes associations based on incomplete information. So in my opinion, one of the key things to understand is that we are all flawed, we are imperfect, but being more aware of those biases and prejudices can help us move beyond them, because we can understand that what I think or my initial reaction maybe isn't right or maybe isn't true, or maybe my eyewitness testimony is constantly going to be flawed because that's who we are. But just starting with an awareness that maybe that shouldn't be a cornerstone then of a criminal justice system is where we start. It's imperfect, it's ever evolving, but part of what I talk about in the book and what I believe is so important is when we call ourselves imperfect and brilliant and flawed, and understanding that we don't have all the answers, that opens up the conversation to something so much bigger, because we start to recognize that we don't have to be perfect to move forward together. And I do think that that is something that's so critical as we start to see the amplification of extremist views, which makes so many people feel left out of the conversation.
That gets us right to the next thing I want to talk about, because you have spent a great deal talking about the brain, and your book, The Human Algorithm, talks about two kinds of brains. It talks, of course, about the human brain, and it also talks about artificial intelligence. Now, I want everybody to know you've got to really pick up this book. And the reason why I'm suggesting people pick up the book is because don't let the sound of it, The Human Algorithm, sound too scientific for you, because you do a great job of laying out the story of what we're seeing happening here, and then you lay about where we're going to go. And so, first of all, what made you decide that you wanted to write about the human algorithm?
As always, such a beautifully phrased question. Thank you so much for that. I always say about my book that part of why I wanted to write it was to bring this more human perspective. And that so often, as you said, people feel completely left out of the conversation, and they feel like they don't have a voice or they couldn't possibly understand. And when a tech platform or when a genre of science says, trust us, we're connecting the world, we're going to give you the answers, that's a red flag, because no one of us has all the answers. No. Many of these tools and technologies were built not with this mission to further humanity and our common good in mind. And we have to remember that we all deserve a seat at the table. And I so appreciate what you said, because I always say, if you read my book and you're not only educated and brought to more understanding, but also have fun and go on the adventure and feel empowered and inspired to understand that you have a voice, then I didn't do my job, because that's not what I was seeing in terms of these conversations, because they're so siloed and so homogenous. And to answer your question about how I came to the book, we talked about it a little bit, but many years ago, I worked with an organization called the Genocide Prevention Center. And we were one of the first teams that was pioneering a way to use technology for humanitarian use. And at that time, pre-social media, pre-internet, we were talking about satellite imagery. So even when we could get access to the satellite images, negotiate with the Russians to take a look and to try to see what was happening on the ground, atrocity, crimes against humanity, such as mass graves, or mass burial sites. And even when we were able to do that and succeeded in some of the first hints of using this technology for humanitarian use, when we could see what was happening on the ground, I remember thinking, okay, so we saw this mass grave, but everyone is already dead and gone. And while it's so incredibly important, as we discussed, to have a record of atrocities so that we can prevent it from ever happening again, I kept thinking, we have to do more. We didn't prevent this. And so that kind of set me down an entire journey and adventure of thinking about the intersection of technology and human rights. And then, of course, more recently, as this discussion of proliferating intelligent technologies has taken off, that has meant artificial intelligence. So I studied these ideas around the world, and I started to get asked to teach and speak and write about them. And so what happened was, of course, because of the future of technology being so dependent on future of intelligent technology, then down the algorithmic rabbit hole I went and started to explore this idea of machine learning and deep learning and what is this going to mean for our future. And most critically, the technology is coming. So for me, the question is, how do we use it for good? How do we use it so the benefits don't just inure to a small group of people, but that we're providing agency and access and opportunity for all of us to be included in the future of society, and better societies that are more focused on justice and more focused on rights? Because it's not enough just to build smarter and better tools. How do we leverage them for good is always the question for me.
Yeah, I think that's one of the concerns that we have, particularly, I think, for underrepresented communities, is that as the AI develops, it's going to be, what's the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. And we've already seen a variety of problems with, algorithms that, for example, don't see people of color, or who misidentify people of color, because the people putting it all in aren't even thinking about us and others. And so one of the things I found interesting in reading your book was you deal very strongly with the idea of we've got to expand who's putting everything in. Otherwise, we're not going to get anything worthwhile out. And I thought that was really great. And what also I found interesting was, you already know my favorite chapter because I already discussed it with you before we went on the air. And that, of course, is the downloading Dickinson and programming Plath. And I think part of what I liked about that the most was the idea of we have to give this artificial intelligence our full experience for it to know how to do its job properly. You talk, for example, about it's not enough to give it a snippet of a speech. You have to give it the whole speech. It's not enough to give it the snippet of a book. You've got to give it the whole book, and you've got to give it this whole look across the board. And part of what you did with that was you also started talking about Jane Goodall. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you were using the Jane Goodall example to get your point across here?
Thank you so much for that question. And I love those parts of the book too. And of course, as you said so poignantly that, and of course, I devote a whole chapter of this in chapter 5, that these aren't just some far off possibilities about how these tools could be used for negative use. The bias and the discrimination is already deeply enmeshed and rooted in these technologies. Algorithmic bias being used for malicious use in criminal justice, this is already here. And these tools are so racist and so sexist because, as you said, there's such a homogenous group for the most part building them. And also, of course, it always goes back to having ethical leadership structures, the people designing policies. And of course, none of this.
And keeping in mind that some of the people doing the inputting and creating these racist and sexist systems don't know that don't intentionally think they're putting it in. It's just that they just don't think about it.
Malicious intent aside, that's what I always say. Malicious intent inside. I mean, when you're talking about these technology platforms, they never could have imagined how big they would be. And so, like you said, so many of the biases are completely subconscious. Again, none of us is perfect. We are born and trained to have these. So absolutely, that's critically important. And part of that awareness that those things are real. And it doesn't, I think that what you're saying is important because that can stop us from having a conversation. But putting the malicious intent and blame aside, these prejudices and discrimination are real. And we're all, trained to have those tendencies, but we have to find ways to move beyond them. And the Jane Goodall is one of many examples, without spoiling the ending to that story too much. But of course, some of you and many of you might be familiar with her story of working as a primatologist. And I talk about her story because for multiple reasons, but one of them is that there's all different types of bias and prejudice and discrimination. And one of the reasons I'm very passionate, and of course, right throughout the book, and a lot about this idea of radical inclusion, representation, equity, justice, and diversity, because there's so much we can't fix. But we can have more voices in the room and be creating more of those spaces where we're working towards equity and towards justice, because malicious intent inside, I could never have your lived experience. I could never understand, as good as my intentions might be, I could never have those lived experiences. And we have to have more people in the room. One of my best friends in the world has cerebral palsy. And she has been her entire life a disability advocate. And she is talking about universal inclusion. She wants to have a ramp at the cafe so she can use a coffee shop. And these are things that people, again, malicious intent inside, might not understand had they not had conversations and listened to people. Also, diversity, of course, across gender and racial lines, but different abilities, different ages. Mm-hmm. A lot of these tools are being built by people that went to the same 2 schools. We need cognitive diversity. And part of why Jane Goodall's story, it's incredible for multiple reasons. One of them is that she came into the field as a novice. Now, there's a lot of, interwoven reasons why that was so. And that's also why the future of these tools needs to be intersectional. It's not just gender. It's not just race. It needs to be intersectional. And she was a novice. In fact, she wasn't even allowed to go without, because she wasn't married. She brought her mother along. She wasn't even allowed to go alone as a woman. And so she started to do this work, this research as a primatologist. And she got an opportunity from Dr. Louis Leakey. And because she came in without all the background of the fancy expertise, she actually wasn't weighed down by the dogma of the time. And because actually experts can sometimes be the worst forecasters taskmasters and the worst communicators in terms of bringing back new ideas is because you get very invested in being right because you are the expert. But she had that beginner's mind and was able to walk in and see something that no human had ever seen, a mixture of grit and of bravery and of opportunities and of access that she was lucky to get and that she worked for. And she was able to go in and think about a whole new way of interacting with the world and other living beings with whom we share our home. So without, spoiling too much of the ending, one of the kind of radical bits about my book that I hope won't always be so radical is I suggest that we actually need to be expanding our definition of rights beyond just human beings and thinking about moving beyond a human-centric view, because we're trying to build an artificial mind. And this idea of artificial intelligence is so frightening to us, in part because it's existential, something that's smarter than us then kicks us down the food chain. And there's something so terrifying about something that's smarter than we are or could ever be. And my suggestion is that what would happen if we didn't always have to be at the center? Now, of course, this is a metaphor not just for that, but for anyone who treats anyone else as less than they are.
Yes.
Right? And what would happen if we made more room and had more inclusion and more space? Actually, in addition to justice and more humane treatment, we actually are going to come up with better ideas, ones we haven't even thought of, because I'm suggesting that the future of intelligent technology actually maybe shouldn't be modeling the human brain. While it's an incredible mechanism, it's so complex and very flawed, and we know so little about it. We don't know why we sleep or dream. We don't exactly know how we make decisions. We don't know how our memories work, except we know they're pretty fallible and malleable. And so what would happen if we had more of an open mind about tapping into the brilliance all around us, the trees and their intricate root systems, pigeons that can solve puzzles and detect cancer in image scans, octopuses that have distributed intelligence and that have personalities and expressions. And when we make more room for others that aren't like us, we all become uplifted and our world becomes a better place. And Jane Goodall and many others I talk about in the book, her story is so incredibly powerful for that reason.
Well, so many people, particularly, I'm going to say it, particularly here in the United States, have the mindset of, yeah, but more for somebody else automatically means less for me. And so how are you, as you're trying to get people to think in this direction of opening up the mindscape, how do you get them to understand, or to at least get to the thought of more for others does not mean less for you? It means more for everyone.
It's a very important question, and there's multiple layers to it. First of all, and we've talked a little bit about this, as you said, that scarcity mentality is incredibly detrimental. But let's not discount some of the very valid reasons that people feel that way. That's because these issues are systematic. It's not just the case of one bad apple or one individual. It's an entire system that props up certain people and things and oppresses others. And so, for example, when you go to a place where every single job has been lost, of course, people that don't have other options or agency are going to be angry and maybe take it out in certain ways. So the idea, this example, for example, of training people for the new types of work we're going to have and need when automation continues to start taking over, we need to be talking about what is the future of work and employment and purpose going to look like for all people. And so that is part of why we're seeing this, this anger and this entrenched extremist views, because perhaps someone with a platform and a microphone promised them something that actually they were never going to get. But when people feel left behind, they feel desperate. And so that's one side of things. On the other hand, is that Victor Hugo says there's nothing like an idea whose time has come. So when we're talking about dismantling systems of oppression and dismantling the things that have kept some people on a pedestal and others not, it is time for those ideas to die and to go to the history books. And when we're talking about fear of others having something because we have had that privilege, that is something we have to work out in ourselves, because those ideas are coming, and having more space and room for more voices is here. It is what being humane and being just is all about. Now, the thing to remember is that, again, this is about building a brighter future for all of us. So the studies and evidence show that when we have more representative, diverse teams, when we have more racial and gender equity, teams perform better, come up with new ideas. And again, to remember that this is all within a system that needs changing. So none of this is possible when we're focusing on the short-term profit margins and being exclusive in terms of who gets to have a seat at the table, which is why it's nothing in isolation, but it's about not just pulling out a chair for myself and not even just pulling out a chair for someone I know, but where is there a voice that isn't heard, that someone is completely unlike me, that can add so much richness and prismatic diversity to who we are. And by the way, it's going to take all of us to meet the challenges ahead. Climate destruction, ecological collapse, terrorism, potential nuclear annihilation, pandemics, global public health issues do not respect borders. And I think that to answer your question, we start to see in a pandemic like now, who is really essential to society? And
yes, that's
what market is doing well, right? So the people that pick and grow your food and teach your children, this is who's essential to society. And when they are sick and don't have hazard and pay and sick leave, it leaves our society in tatters. And so for us to rise is to bring the most marginalized to the center. And that is how we solve these problems that are facing us in the future. And it's not easy, and it is going to feel difficult in multiple ways, but we can do difficult things. And we are much stronger when we work together, and we are going to need every bit of brilliance we have across our planet to meet the challenges ahead.
Flynn, I have to tell you, your job, your task, I don't envy it at all, because I only have to deal or convince on a regular basis, an audience of 6 to 14 people at a time. You're trying to deal with a much larger audience on much bigger scales. And so I know you're into yoga, and I have to ask, what are some of the things that you do to deal with that kind of stress? Because when I'm done with a case, that case is over. I move on to the next one. You're dealing with so many bigger issues that you deal with one country, then you got another issue, and another one, another issue, another one, and it's all reflective of this big thing. How do you find the time to be able to, and how do you unwind to refresh yourself to come back and fight that fight the next day?
Well, I do appreciate that question, but I will just say that I think moving away from this idea that someone is dealing with bigger issues, or that those stresses that I am thinking about are bigger, I think in a way discounts that there's so many different ways to make a difference. And again, using the tools or the career or what we have in the moment is the way that we can be speaking to our audience or connecting with our community or our school or our family. And I think that there's dignity in all work. And there's no such thing as unskilled labor. And there's that soft and hard skills dichotomy, I think, is completely misses the nuance that we can all make that change with whatever we have at hand. And we don't know what's ahead. And so I think that if everyone understood how much their story and their voice matters, we would be able to see, oh, this is what I can do, because it's going to take so many different types of skills and brilliance to figure all of this out. And we all have strengths and weaknesses. And so really tackling what we can with what we have, and also just adding our lived experience to the conversation, is incredibly invaluable. And in terms of dealing with those stresses and thinking about these issues, I think that what comes to mind when you were asking that question is it's such a great honor and a privilege. I believe we're here to care for each other, to serve others, and to do what we can with what we have in that moment. And you find the energy when you think about what you truly believe in and what truly matters. And that is our job. Each of our job is to be who we are and to use our voice and whatever we have to speak up for ourselves and for others, and to take what we believe in and let that be the axis that guides all of our decisions, and to always come back to the heart of that mission and that goal. How can we make the world a little bit better today, in corners large and small, because it is going to take all of us. And I think recognizing and having just such appreciation and gratitude for being alive and having one more day to be able to do that work, or to constantly be thinking about this idea that it's such a grand privilege of life to be able to experience being here for this very short time that we have, and to recognize individually we're so small. But if we can send out one trickle of hope and do one thing or take one step, brick by brick together, individually we're so small, but together there's really no star we can't dream of exploring. So I consider it my great privilege, but my deepest responsibility to serve others. And we're here to care for each other. And that takes so many different forms. What you do, what anyone is doing, there is dignity and pride to be found in all of it, because it is going to take all of us.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, you will see why we often will say the student has become the master. Outstanding. Now, Flynn, I know that you've got to get ready to run soon, but let me just quickly hit this. I want to talk. I want people to know you can go to flynncoleman.community to see what Flynn is up to, including a chance to look at the Melina project that she's involved in. Also, Flynn, are you still doing book tours, or have those been canceled now?
Yes, no, things have gone a bit virtual lately, of course. But absolutely, it's going virtual, and yes, that is still ongoing. Absolutely.
Okay. Do you want to plug where your tour is going right now?
You already said it brilliantly, which is everything now can be found at flynncoleman.community in terms of virtual online events. And also, of course, as the world opens up, more future events all over the world. And I would love to connect with you. I want to hear your thoughts. That's my great joy, is to hear what people are doing. So yeah, that's the place to find any information and to connect.
Absolutely. Flynn, thank you so much. As I said, I'm so incredibly proud of you, as I think all the teachers who've had you are, and you keep doing the good work, you keep doing the good writing, and we'll keep paying attention to it.
Thank you so much. Well, as we've discussed, sometimes all it takes is one teacher and someone to believe in you and encourage you. And it's such a blessing to be able to connect in this way, because being able to be a teacher, as you said, is one of those great ways that we can be of service. And I'm just so grateful to know you and to be here. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, shucks, you're going to make me blush. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank you again for joining us here with Wrestling with the Law and Stuff. Again, make sure that you check out flynncoleman.community. Also follow her on Twitter. As well, coming up over the next few weeks, let me tell you who we've got that we're going to be posting up soon. Rebecca Scott, who is also another former Brentwood student. She's a writer, director. We also have Pat Cronin. Our interview with him goes up. Pat Cronin is a noted actor and also professor in Tennessee. Great stories to tell. Hurricane John Walters, who you may recall from Lucha Libre USA as RJ Brewer, and Les Thatcher, the legendary wrestling trainer, author, wrestler, promoter, publicist. I think that Les did just about everything in the business. So with that, we want you to get through this pandemic. We want you to hold good thoughts for others as you get through the rest of the day. And remember, no matter what it is you're wrestling with, come on over and let's wrestle with it together. Thank you and bye-bye.